Okay, so now we're going to get into Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma, the first section dealing with industrial corn. And the first chapter in that section is Corn's Conquest. He asks, again, where does your food come from? And he takes a sort of tour, or takes us through a tour of the grocery store, and basically makes the point that unbeknownst to most of us, corn is in almost everything somehow that we see in the grocery store, including the meat, because animal feeds hinge on corn quite a bit, and certainly including processed foods, which when you look at the breakdown of ingredients, many of those ingredients he shows are disguised elements of corn, different byproducts of corn. I think of the Twinkie. I think he mentions the Twinkie, which is this product by Hostess, a company that, in a sense, doesn't exist in the same way it used to before. It went bankrupt, but then it was, the name was purchased by a different company. I'm not sure who that is, but it's basically the same product that's always been made. And if you've ever had a Hostess Twinkie, you know it's very tasty and delicious, but do you really have any idea what's in that thing? And it turns out that it's just got an ingredient list that's, some of those things are not too recognizable. So he draws our attention to this. He just goes on to point out that corn is in, as I mentioned before, animal feeds. So it's in our beef, in our pork, in our chicken, and the chicken's eggs. It's even in salmon. Corn is in a lot of course, almost all processed foods, for instance, in corn syrup and other byproducts. Also in non-foods, like, as I understand it, the grocery store bags, at least in grocery stores that I've used, are made partly with corn byproducts. So, Pollan introduces this idea also in the Plant's Eye View video that I asked you to watch, the TED Talk, that really, if you look at it from a certain unconventional angle, it is not humans that have conquered corn, but corn has conquered humans. You can see humans as toiling away, doing ever more to propagate industrial corn, which is a type of corn that doesn't actually reproduce itself naturally, but needs humans every step of the way to help it reproduce. And I won't even go into the discussion of how it reproduces. I'm sure you found that sort of interesting. So, corn became a huge part of the American diet. It's, of course, an edible vegetable. That's a different variety. The sweet corn that you get in the grocery store is different from a lot of the corn that's produced in these huge operations, which are producing a much more durable and corn that can be stored, because it can be dried and hardened and stored and turned into grain that then can keep for a long time, animal feed, and even be turned into alcohol. Corn has been engineered by human beings to become very, very sturdy so that it can hold up to the industrial harvesting techniques that we now have. So if you don't know what a combine harvester is, don't feel bad. I didn't realize this myself until I took a good look at how this is done. But combine harvesters take corn right out of the field and somehow manage to shuck the corn, take off the kernels, grind up and eject everything else back into the ground. I'm looking at Explain That Stuff, How Combine Harvesters Work, right, on the internet. And it says, a threshing drum beats the cut crops to break and shake the grains away from their stalks. The grains fall through sieves into a collecting tank below. The chaff, or unwanted material, passes along conveyors called straw walkers toward the back of the machine. More grain falls into the tank. So this is all done in the field, in other words. And it's a very complex machine, and these things are huge, and corn has been bred to stand up to and be amenable to this harvesting technique. So in the second chapter, The Farm, Pollan highlights the Naylor farm, which is just an example of a typical corn farm. He says that this farm used to be very diversified. It grew a lot of different crops and it rotated those crops, but that over time it had turned into a farm that produced a couple of crops, soybeans and corn, I believe. And this basically represents the pattern of American agriculture, moving from farms that were diversified, that had a variety of both plants, animals, and in which everything kind of supported everything else, which is a subject we'll get into more in this class, to something called monoculture, which is the growing of one or at the most a couple of crops, typically one, and most importantly, of course, the subject of this section, corn. But I think the most important part of this chapter is the point that this farmer is representative of many farmers who are not able to make a profit off of the corn that they're growing, even though they've grown more and more. He says that the Naylor farm feeds 129 people through the production of its corn. And of course, we see these signs across the countryside of farmers feeding that many people with the produce of their farm. The Naylor corn is not made for human beings. It's not to be eaten directly by human beings, but the corn goes into animal feed, and it could maybe even go into fuel, but namely into animal feed, which then people eat indirectly when they eat meat. He says at the time of his writing that a bushel of that corn costs $1 more to produce than to buy. So the question is, how did that happen, and why do people continue to grow corn, even though the free market would suggest that you not grow a product that is actually costing you money to grow? Well, modern agricultural techniques require bigger machinery, and it comes at a high price. So one of the reasons for this is that once farmers have become invested in growing a certain crop and they've bought into the machinery, a quicker short-term solution is to simply grow more of the same product, hopefully more cheaply, so that you can actually somehow make a profit. One way to do that, to make it as efficient as possible, is to not have any diversity and not to rotate crops. Pollan explains that corn doesn't fix nitrogen well in the soil, and nitrogen is a natural fertilizer. It's part of what makes the land fertile, and soybeans and other legumes do, and so this is why farmers often had rotated, and many of them still do, but the cheapest and fastest way to try to make a profit is to not do that, and instead to add chemical or synthetic fertilizer instead of trying to mix in as much of this natural fertilizer as possible. So whereas in the past the land would have been fertilized by a mixture of green manure, which is plant material, and animal droppings, now there's an alternative. And Pollan actually goes back to where this came from. He mentions in 1909 a German scientist by the name of Fritz Haber invented artificial or chemical fertilizers using fossil fuels, and so that's where it comes from. And with this invention, then, farmers were able to apply fertilizer that they could buy and did not have to rotate their crops, and could also plant much more closely together and replenish the soil with this artificial fertility. He says, what had been a local sun-driven cycle of fertility in which the legumes fed the corn, which fed the livestock, which in turn, with their manure, fed the corn, was now broken. Still, the question remains, why do farmers continue to grow a crop despite, aside from the fact that they've sunken costs into the machinery, why do they continue to grow a crop that seems unprofitable? So, as he points out, there's a long history to this. I found a piece called Corn in the USA from the Historical Society, from the history. This is a blog devoted to history for the Academy and beyond. And it's a pretty good summary of what Pollan's talking about here. So it says, during the Depression, when under FDR, the government began to regulate production, paying farmers to keep land fallow and offering loans to tide farmers over in bad market periods. The restriction of corn production managed to keep prices high enough to keep farmers from starving, but it did make food prices susceptible to sudden rises, a volatility that could be a terrible political liability for presidents. Federal regulation of production managed the corn crop until 1972, when the sale of 30 million tons of corn to Russia combined with a bad harvest to make domestic corn prices spike. This meant that animal feed prices rose too, and higher prices found their way into the supermarket. By 1973, food prices were so high that meat became a luxury, and middle-class mothers worried about feeding their children. President Nixon well understood the political power of a restive middle class, and he launched a new program to make sure that food prices fell quickly. Nixon's second Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, dramatically changed government support for corn. No longer would the government support prices by managing the crop. After the carefully named Agriculture and Consumer Production Act of 1973, aka the Farm Act of 1973, the government urged as much production as possible and guaranteed farmers a target price for their corn. Rather than limiting production, the government made direct payments to farmers for every bushel of corn they produced. Under the new system, production climbed into billions of bushels. Production got another boost after 2005, when that year's Energy Policy Act required increasing amounts of ethanol made from corn to be mixed with gasoline. 2 years later, President George Bush launched an initiative to turn even more dramatically to ethanol to reduce the nation's dependence on oil by 20% by 2017. So I think the takeaway from this type of history is that government has intervened quite dramatically in the corn market for quite a long time, and it has distorted the market so that it's possible for farmers to continue to produce, let's say overproduce, a commodity and not go entirely bankrupt, although it has resulted in the consolidation of farms so that the small farmer has, been kind of squeezed out, and only those that can afford to buy vast stretches of land remain. And so corporate farming has become more and more the thing and the entity that can deal with this scale of production and is the beneficiary of a lot of the government subsidies and programs that regulate farm production. The blog that I'm looking at says the scientific journal Nature immediately warned that this initiative would actually move the development of biofuels backward rather than forward, since corn is inefficient as a fuel. But corn farmers loved the proposal. Corn production leaped even higher. Today, more than a quarter of that production goes to produce ethanol. And so, to sum up so far, we've developed an over-reliance on one crop. We've made that crop and the harvesting of it ever more efficient, but we have also, in order to do that, taken a lot of costs on, including the cost of very expensive machinery, which is hard to extricate oneself from. To pay it back takes a long time, so it increases commitment to continue with the system. Also, costs including the use of a lot of chemical fertilizer. And this system has been propped up by rather massive government intervention, which has been going on since the Great Depression in one form or another. On the latter point, he states that nearly half of the average Iowa corn farmer's income came from government subsidies, and these subsidies made up about a quarter of the $19 billion the United States government spent on payments to farmers each year. So the third chapter, the elevator, deals with what happens to the corn once it leaves the farmer. It gets delivered to the grain elevators, and there it gets mixed with the corn from a lot of other places. And so there's some consternation from Pollan about the fact that once it gets to this point, there's no way that you can tell exactly what farm the corn came from. Now, it may not seem like that big of a deal, but ultimately Pollan is invested in the idea that you should know where your food comes from. So right then and there, long before you would think it would happen, you've lost track of exactly where your food has come from. It's going to go, this type of corn is going to go into animals and into additives and byproducts, and it's not going to be like eaten as sweet corn, but nevertheless, you would think that you could locate the loss of location a little bit later on down the chain, but it happens right there when the corn gets mixed together from many different farms in the surrounding area, and then it gets shipped off to even bigger collection points where it's more mixed together. And he talks about how two major companies are involved in the use of corn in so many different ways, Cargill and ADM, or Archer Daniels Midland. He says they buy about a third of the corn grown in America, and then they are involved in every step of the process of turning it into a variety of things, from pesticide to fertilizer to animal feed to ethanol to high fructose corn syrup, and many other products. So he alerts us to the idea that these two major corporations have an extraordinary influence over our food supply, but not only that, he also makes mention of their political influence, because they're big enough to hire lobbyists and to contribute to candidates for political office that will keep this whole system of government intervention and propping up and all of that going. So at this point, if you're reading Pollan sympathetically, you start to feel as though he's spinning out a bit of a tragedy here. A tragedy is a situation where people didn't start out at all intending for a certain ending point to occur, and yet it does. That you can see, looking back, that every step of the way, every decision that was made led to this, the terrible consequence. And such would be the case here, that, the desire for efficiency, the desire to help people during the Depression, the desire to make production more efficient and cheaper, the desire to make sure that farmers didn't go bankrupt, that the consumer had cheap and plentiful food. All of that led to the current situation, which is arguably not good for farmers or for the consumers. So the next chapter, chapter 4, the feedlot, starts out with Pollan deciding to buy a cow at Pokey Feedlot in Kansas to find out if he can learn more about how the cow is raised and see if he can, basically trace where his food comes from in this way. But it quickly turns into a chapter on the whole problem of the concentrated animal feedlot operations, or feeding operations, CAFOs. 60% of corn, he says, goes to feed livestock, and these large operations, in this case cattle feeding operation, breaks that natural cycle again Remember that the artificial fertilizer broke the cycle already when one crop was produced, and it was a crop that did not fix nitrogen, that could be raised repeatedly and without the introduction of animal manure in the undiversified farm. And yet through the application of artificial fertilizers continue to be grown every year. Well, here with the CAFO, the concentrated animal feeding operations, the cycle is broken again. In the natural cycle of a diversified farm, the animals would feed on plants grown, for that purpose, grazing on grass in the fields, and their manure would be used to fertilize the crops, including the grass, but other crops planted by the farmer. So literally cow manure, chicken manure, every other kind of manure can be used by the traditional farmer to fertilize the soil. So it's not wasted, it goes back into the soil and it becomes the cycle. But the concentrated animal feeding operations treat manure as waste. It doesn't tend to go back into into crops somewhere, but oftentimes remains in large retaining areas. I'm sure this isn't always the case, and that some of this manure is turned into fertilizer, but the problem is a lot of it isn't, and it becomes seen as waste, a sort of waste byproduct of this type of animal husbandry. So it basically becomes pollution, and so you have this irony of the manure now really becoming pollution, and sitting there and becoming a health hazard, as a matter of fact, to the people living nearby, perhaps. And at the same time, ironically, a few miles away may be a farmer that could use that manure, but is applying artificial fertilizer to his crops. So you see the theme here of specialization. You've got the monoculture crop of corn being grown maybe 5 miles away from the CAFO, producing nothing but beef. And both of them are very intent on doing things as efficiently as possible. And so that doesn't include cooperating with any sort of cycle. So both of them break this natural cycle and have more costs as a result. There's more inputs that need to be paid for and provided in the system. But in some ways it's simpler, and of course it reduces the cost of these commodities. In the case of the CAFOs, the cows are eating mainly corn. Naturally, he says cows are ruminants. They eat grass, and they walk along and they poop on the ground, right? And then that goes back into the ground or gets scooped up by the farmer and piled up and then used in his traditional farm. That's not the case here. When cows eat more corn and other things other than grass, their digestive system can't handle it as well. And so the most efficient means of avoiding sickness in cows with a different kind of diet like this is to use antibiotics. And so there's a tendency to put antibiotics directly into the feed in order to prevent illness in the cattle. And also he mentions the use of hormones in cattle to make them, with the combination of the corn diet, which is a very calorific diet, and probably a relative lack of activity on the part of concentrated cows, they fatten up a lot more quickly, so meat can be obtained much more quickly, which makes it cheaper. There's a much quicker turnover in this type of cattle production than in grass-fed cattle. They also produce a fattier meat, which people tend to, taste-wise, prefer. He also mentions in this chapter that there's another irony, which is because the cows eat mainly corn, we have to realize that where that corn came from, it was obtained through the use of a lot of fossil fuels, both in the chemical fertilizer, but also in the reaping and the harvesting and the taking it to wherever it ends up being consumed. And so our beef and other meat, it represents a lot of spent fossil fuels. So that still leaves a lot of corn that isn't edible directly to be accounted for. So where does the other 40% go that doesn't go to raising meat? So in chapter 5, which is the processing plant, I think the tragic element of the chapter is the story about how a very cheap commodity, corn, is turned into expensive products like breakfast cereal. Basically what he's saying is that the farmers are being kept alive, so to speak, in their business via government intervention. And meanwhile, companies, big corporations like Coca-Cola and General Mills, are taking that commodity, bought at a very cheap price, and then processing it into these products like soda and like breakfast cereals and many, many other things to produce products that you buy at the grocery store that pay them far more money. And if we take a look at these products like the breakfast cereal, like Corn Flakes or Cocoa Puffs or Lucky Charms, we find that major ingredient is corn. But to buy a box of these things, and granted I haven't bought one in a while, but I'm betting they're like $4 a box. That box of cereal represents a minuscule amount of corn, literally probably a few pennies worth of corn that has been highly processed, reconstituted, colored, and put in a box that's appealing to the consumer and their children in the case of cereal, well, in the case of Coca-Cola too, that is then bought for astronomically more money. I think, again, the theme of tragedy applies here because yet again we see the sort of absurdity from Pollan's point of view of this whole enterprise, that is this point that the corn has been turned into something that's unrecognizable. People don't really know what they're eating, and furthermore, they're mainly paying for processing and packaging rather than the actual food that they don't know where it came from. Here's a list of corn byproducts, just so you can kind of get a feel for how many things are made by corn, with corn, I should say, or maybe by corn if you take Pollan's point of view about the plant's eye view. This is from the University of Rochester Medicine website, Children's Hospital. It's on a website dealing with a corn-free diet for kids that can't have corn in their diet, and it points out that there's just so many products that have corn that it's very difficult for people who are allergic to corn somehow to be able to avoid it. So, but here's some of them. They list corn flour, cornmeal, corn gluten, corn flakes, etc., corn starch, also listed on labels as starch or vegetable starch, corn oil, corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup, dextrins, maltodextrins, dextrose, fructose or crystalline fructose, hydrol, treacle, ethanol, free fatty acids, maize, zyme, sorbitol. So if you look at the back of your products, you will find that these ingredients do appear in a lot of products that you buy in the grocery store. Chapter 6 is the consumer. And the question is, so with all of this corn, how do we get consumers to consume all of it? He says the answer has often been to make food cheaper and to make it bigger, to sell people larger quantities of it, whether it's at the fast food restaurant or regular restaurants or in the grocery store, and to charge them more for it, but it's enough more that it still seems like a bargain. There's the tragic irony that the highly processed food is going to taste better to the taste buds, at least immediately, because it's more sugary and saltier and easier to eat than unprocessed foods. And human beings were evolved to be attracted to when they came upon something like honey, for instance, that was very sweet. They might gorge on that, or if they came on an animal and were able to kill it, they might eat it all. This is the way human beings evolved. And so when faced with foods that are high in calories, that are sweet, or that are fatty, the instinctual tendency is to eat as much of them as possible, with the sort of evolutionary notion that you might not know where your next meal came from. Of course, we don't live in that world anymore, but our bodies may still react that way. And of course, the outcome of this for Americans can be gaining weight, leading to obesity and all the health problems related to obesity, including diabetes. But I think you'll find in this class that some people who note these trends blame the consumer, or put most of the responsibility on the consumer for making these wrong choices. But Pollan really doesn't, I don't think, here. He points out that these products are a lot cheaper than healthy food. If you go into a grocery store and you buy fresh vegetables and meat, you're going to pay a lot more per calorie than you would if you went in and bought pasta and boxes of mixes and various packaged products that would be a whole lot easier for you to make at home too. There's that whole dynamic which he deals with in other works, as well as later in this book. You have to actually cook that stuff. You have to know what to do with it. Whereas if you go and buy hamburger helper from the whatever aisle that is, where the pasta is, and you don't have to do very much. Just mix the hamburger up with it, and away you go. So it's cheaper, it's easier, it tastes better, and the palate gets used to that taste and wants more of it. And so to say that the consumer is to blame is really not good enough for Pollan. Instead, he does turn back to government policies, to the problem that we discussed earlier of this government subsidization, this government intervention in our agricultural production, which has enabled and encouraged this overproduction of corn in particular, which has led to all of these other effects and ends up affecting very much the diet of the average American, who is urged to buy through advertising, buy and consume more and more processed food. So in the final chapter, The Meal, Pollan eats the quintessential processed food meal, a McDonald's chicken McNuggets and cheeseburger meal, with his family as they drive down the highway. Now, there's no doubt that from a certain angle this tastes really good, and Pollan admits that. And anybody who's ever had McDonald's knows that there's a certain satisfaction in eating it. And yet at the same time, he asks, again, the question that this whole section began with, where does this come from? And when you look at it from that perspective, it just raises this sort of looming question, hopefully, he thinks, in the reader's mind, right? What am I eating exactly? Where did this come from? What is it? And this is no particular criticism of McDonald's. In particular, McDonald's is just a representative of highly processed, cheap, fast food. He points out if you ask a person who's eating McDonald's meal where did that come from? They'll say McDonald's, right? But they would have no ability to know where it actually came from, as in, where it was produced, where in the country or even in the world the meat and the grain and different parts of it came from. Nor would they probably even ask that question. And I think that's ultimately what he's trying to get at here in this final chapter, is that we've lost even the question. When we are asked where does our food come from, we say the grocery store, a particular grocery store like Dillon's or Kroger's or Hy-Vee or Whole Foods or whatever, or from some restaurant that we got it from, or some takeout place. But we don't, it doesn't occur to us to say, oh, it's from this and that farm. And even if it did occur to us, we would have no way of knowing. So I guess the big question that we're left with here is Pollan right that ultimately this is a tragedy, and that the results of all of this are more harmful than good for the average consumer? On the one hand, there's an abundance of calories. Food is cheaper as a result of these of all of these things that he's talked about. But on the other hand, arguably the food is less healthy. It's more artificial. For instance, in the case of the breakfast cereal and breads and all of these types of things, pasta, oftentimes they're fortified with vitamins because on their own they wouldn't be enough to keep people healthy. Also, the production process has depleted the soil, has created pollution, has used more fossil fuels, all of which he thinks have been more harmful. They've produced more harm than they've helped. But there's also no getting around the fact that we now create more calories, more food than we've ever done before, and that could be beneficial in the sense that we have the potential to reduce hunger a great deal because of our ability to just mass manufacture food. Yet it's more complicated than that, obviously. We have the potential to greatly reduce or eliminate starvation, but the fact that we have the potential hasn't led to the elimination of hunger, even in this country, let alone in other parts of the world. So there's other pieces that are missing that would make that a possibility for real. And I guess I've been more charitable to the McDonald's meal than Pollan has been. By the end of the chapter, he's not too flattering to the McDonald's meal, basically treating it as a sort of almost an illusion of an actual food. It's like you're buying the idea of a cheeseburger while not really eating one. I don't know about that, but when you stack a fast food hamburger next to a restaurant hamburger, I guess if you imagine that comparison, you might be able to see or feel what Pollan's trying to get at there. He really wants to say that companies like McDonald's, or like General Mills, I should say, Tyson, all these big food companies have spent a great deal of money processing, making palatable, and then maybe most importantly marketing food, and that the marketing is more important to the consumer at a certain point than the actual food, and that we have become rather reflexive in our food choices because of the marketing that's aimed at us, and how costly and sometimes difficult it is to get a different type of food and to pursue a different diet. It's become a challenge for people in the Western world, at least, to actually feed themselves in a healthy way. In another work, Pollan contrasts fast food with slow food, and slow food, of course, is the whole foods that you actually have to process yourself. You take the chicken. I remember when my mom used to buy a chicken, it was a whole chicken, and she actually cut that sucker up, for instance. Okay? It was already devoid of feathers, but she had to actually cut it up. And I know how to cut up a chicken because she made me do it. We snapped beans, you know, and put them in a pressure cooker. Yeah, so I mean, the art of cooking is something that people feel like they can't really afford. You know, you've got processed foods that are way faster and cheaper, and of course people, men and women, are both working and working long and hard these days in a lot of cases. So who cooks, and where do you find the time, even if you can afford to do that? Anyway, these are some of the problems that Michael Pollan deals with in this and other works that he's written. So Pollan helps us by introducing some concerns and giving us a fairly broad picture of some of the problems with the American, or more broadly the Western, food system, and introduces this idea of the breaking of the cycle in agriculture, which is something we can take up later on in this course. So I hope that you've enjoyed Pollan's work, even if you disagree with it or think that it's a little bit or a lot wrong. Hopefully you've learned a lot about various aspects of American agriculture by reading Michael Pollan.